Senator Paterson.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President, and I'm again privileged to be contributing to a debate with you back in the chair, and can I say how pleasing that is. It feels like the natural order of this place has been restored, and I hope there will be much more of it. It's wonderful to begin a Monday morning in the Senate on such a positive note, with a terrific and important bill before the Senate. Mr Acting Deputy President, through you, can I please congratulate the Minister for her leadership on this issue and on many other issues. This is a minister who will already go down as the minister who saved truck drivers, owner-driver truck drivers this year. This is a minister who will already go down as the minister who saved the CFA volunteers, and I hope with the agreement of the Senate in due course, this will also be the minister who will go down who saved union members from being ripped off by dodgy union officials. The contributions to the debate so far this morning, I think, have been very instructive. I listened carefully, as I always do, to Senator Cameron's contributions and, of course, to Senator Rhiannon's contributions as well. And although they were very passionate as always and erudite as always, I thought it was very revealing what they chose to talk about and what they did not speak about. In fact, they spoke very little about the bill that is before us today. They spoke very little about its provisions, about what it seeks to do, about the problems that it seeks to address. Instead, what they spoke about at some length and in some detail is the union movement generally, and its achievements and its accomplishments and its role in society. Senator Rhiannon was even talking about how some people in our society find it difficult to pay their rent, to find time off work to look after their kids. These are good and worthy topics and important issues, but not ones which relate to this bill directly or, frankly, in my view, even indirectly. So what I'd like to do this morning, Mr Acting Deputy President, is return to the bill itself and talk about what it actually seeks to achieve, and see if we can help enlighten the Senate about what we're actually debating and focusing on this morning and throughout this week. What the government is asking the Senate to do is to ensure that both unions and employer organisations are subject to similar levels of transparency and accountability that we all require of companies. The Fair Work Registered Organisations Bill 2014 will establish a focused regulator to oversee unions and employer groups with strong powers to enforce the law. It will mean officials from unions and employer groups will be subject to similar standards as company directors under corporations law, including more thorough reporting and disclosure, and for those who break the law, bigger penalties. This legislation is important because across Australia there are 47 unions and 63 employer groups with annual revenues of $1.5 billion and assets of $2.5 billion. More than 2 million members trust these organisations with their money. Honest workers deserve to know their union or employer group is acting in their best interests. And these organisations have special privileges under the law, and I think it's appropriate that with those special privileges also becomes reasonable obligations and expectations of accountability and transparency. For example, these organisations are exempt from paying income tax, and all Australians deserve to know as a result of that how they are being accountable for that privilege. Unions in particular have other special legal privileges that are not afforded to other organisations or companies or individuals in our society, such as, for example, the right of entry to a workplace. With such a special legal privilege, I don't think it is unreasonable for them to be held at only the same standard as a company director or a corporation. I want to talk a little bit about how this legislation will work. The bill contains measures to improve the standard of governance of registered organisations and to deter wrongdoing. They include, for example, a focused regulator to be called the Registered Organisations Commission, with appropriate resources and powers modelled on those of corporate regulators. Number 2, enhanced financial accountability provisions. Number 3, meaningful sanctions that can be applied when any wrongdoing is revealed. Some of these new accountability measures for unions and employer groups will include requiring registered organisations to disclose remuneration paid to their top 5 highest paid officers in the head office and any branches, requiring officers whose duties relate to financial management to disclose material personal interests, and ensuring officers don't make decisions on matters where they have a conflict of interest. It is difficult to understand what anyone would object to among those provisions, and indeed perhaps that is why the senators who've spoken in opposition to this bill this morning have not referred to any of these provisions. I note that Senator Dastyari is coming up to speak next, and I have a challenge for him, and that is to address the merits of the bill and these provisions in particular, and I look forward to hearing his specific concerns about these measures if he is indeed joining with his colleagues and opposing this bill. The legislation also, I welcome that, Senator Dastyari. The legislation also introduces higher civil penalties and a range of criminal penalties for organisations and officials who are found by courts to have done the wrong thing. For example, civil penalties ranging from $18,000 to $216,000 for individuals and up to $1,080,000 for the body corporate. Criminal penalties for reckless or intentionally dishonest breaches of officers' duties up to $360,000 or 5 years imprisonment or both. Mr Acting Deputy President, I'd like to talk about some of the events which led to the government to form the view that this was a necessary measure. This is not something that the government decided to do on a whim or without any evidence. It's something that the government has done in response to major incidents and events of defrauding of union members' funds and misuse of union officials' powers. Here are just some examples, and I think it's important to note for the record that this applies to a range of unions, not just a handful. It applies to a range of union officials, not just a couple of bad apples, and it is not ancient history. Many of these incidents are current. Indeed, there is a case in the courts this very week relating to the National Union of Workers and an alleged fraud of up to $400,000 of union members' money. This is not ancient history. This is current issues facing union members and unions across the country. For example, TWU officials spent over $300,000 purchasing modified American utes, which were used for personal purposes. One official even attached personalised number plates to his ute. Another official had the union's redundancy policy redrafted so that he could take his car with him once he left the union, which happened not very long at all after the purchase of that truck. National Union of Workers officials and staff have used members' funds on dating websites, sports tickets, toys and holidays. NUW officials and staff use corporate cards and credit cards to buy holidays worth over $18,000, sports tickets worth over $4,000, toys worth over $670, dating websites worth over $2,200, hairdressing, iTunes purchases over $1,500 and other personal purchases. Again, back to our friends at the Transport Workers Union, we had Assistant Secretary John Berger as the Tasmanian Superannuation Liaison Officer for TWU Super from 2009 to 2012. He was also an employee of the TWU at that time. In the 2011-12 financial year, Berger spent only 5 days in Tasmania, with half of his time devoted to his duties on behalf of TWU Super. The TWU then billed the superannuation fund $93,434 for his work in that financial year. That is a pretty spectacular rate of pay. Senator Cameron was very concerned about Wall Street rates of pay, but I think we should be looking very closely at Tasmanian rates of pay on that hourly basis. I think there'd be many Wall Street traders who'd be envious of that kind of remuneration. This invoiced amount covered exactly half of Berger's total annual salary. He reluctantly agreed during the union's Royal Commission with Jeremy Stoljar SC that on the maths, quote, the invoice that was put in claims $93,000 for 2.5 days' work. Obviously a very productive union official. Another matter which senators may be aware of, the Leader of the Opposition's campaign director, wages were paid by a construction company, obviously a very kind and considerate construction company. Mr Shorten accepted a $40,000 donation from one of the companies negotiating a pay deal with the Australian Workers Union, Unibuilt. At the time he was Australian Workers Union National Secretary and campaigning to become a Member of Parliament. The donation was used to pay the wages of Shorten's campaign staffer in 2007, but was not disclosed until 2 days before the Royal Commission asked him about these matters in the sworn evidence, quite a number of years later, as senators will be aware. And finally, one final example, the Australian Workers Union again was identified as having been engaged in issuing false invoices. The Royal Commission heard that Caesar Mellom, a member of the Upper House and State Parliament and Labor MP, repeatedly issued false invoices to companies marked as training, occupational health and safety or similar, when in fact they were actually payments for union membership in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Australian Workers' Union membership roll contained the names of workers as well as horse racing jockeys who had never agreed to become members of the union. These are just a handful. These are just a snapshot of the many instances of which union officials have engaged in untoward conduct where union members' money has been misspent. We have not even spoken today about, so far, the Health Services Union and the spectacular misuse of members' funds that occurred there under the stewardship of a previous member of the other place. But I have no doubt that other senators will contribute some details about that case later on in the debate. It is very clear that union members have been taken for a ride by union officials for far too long, and it is fallen on this government to take action to address it. It shouldn't require a coalition government to address this. The previous Labor government was confronted with a very similar set of facts and could have taken measures to address this, but they chose not to. They chose to instead side with union officials over union members, and that is something that this government will not do, and I commend the bill to the Senate.